Alright guys, strap in, because today we're going to explore woodworking's largest hidden gem. And let's just say, it's not as simple as it sounds. I'm sure all of you have heard at one point or another about the hidden gems of woodworking. While many of those claims seem to fall flat, today I plan to explore that statement a bit more literally. I've talked a lot in the past about gems that make woodworking projects stand out, but what about the actual shape of gems? There are a ton of fun angles to explore within that idea, so I wanted to do just that with this project. Now when I think of gemstones, I think about their natural beauty. So for this build, I'm going to be using some lumber species that I enjoy in their natural state. That is to say, I'm not going to use any stains or dyes with this piece, but instead went with cherry and walnut. Before we get too deep into the thick of it, let's take a moment to check out the design. So this piece is going to be a low and large coffee table. It sports some pretty geometric shapes in the legs and top, and a seamless drawer for storing remotes and other trinkets. The drawer box is going to be dovetailed, and the frame will feature mortise and tenon joinery, while the lower shelf will be shiplap. So, needless to say, there's a lot going on with this gem. So the first thing I wanted to focus on was the top and legs, because I know I have to glue up a pretty large panel for the tabletop and laminate some pieces to create the thickness I need for my legs. I'm also wanting to try to keep my order of operations consistent, so at this point, I'm also going to go ahead and mill down my parts for my stretchers and rails. But I am keeping all my parts oversized so that I can plane back to their final dimensions later on. Now, full disclosure, I originally designed this piece to have a live edge top. But upon sifting through slabs available at the lumberyard and a few other local lumber dealers, I didn't find anything that really fit the dimension or look I was going for. That is without going the river table route, which just isn't my cup of tea. No hate, just not for me. But I guess you could think of that original design as more of embracing an uncut gem style. I don't know, maybe on the next one. So now that we've passed the Adam Sandler phase, I can get on to planing down the edges of my tree slices. In the past, I would have muscled these guys across the joiner, but today I find it a lot easier just to use a joiner plane. It's not that one way is better than the other, but the joiner plane is a little easier on my back. Yeah, only a little. With the edges jointed, I can head back over to the assembly table and lay out the orientation for my tabletop. Now since these chunks are pretty large, I want to make the most out of their thickness, so I'm going to use a domino to help align the faces, which is what I'm about to lay out now. And to do that, I'm just going to use a straight edge and mark out a few locations for about 5 dominoes. Now obviously if you don't own a domino, for this section, biscuits or dowels would work just fine. In fact, this will be the only time I use a domino in this build for you purists out there. When you are laying out dominoes, biscuits, or dowels, I think it's a good idea to go ahead and stagger those across the top of your panel. And what I mean by that is don't align all your dominoes across your panel from front to back. This way you don't accidentally glue your parts in an incorrect orientation later on. If all your joints are aligned perfectly, the odds of making a mistake during the glue up go up pretty significantly. So do yourself a favor and offset those a bit. Now when it comes to gluing up large panels alone in the shop, I tend to use my clamps to help me squeeze my boards together as I add more of them, which goes pretty quickly. And once my panel was glued up, I could go ahead and laminate the boards for my legs. Now, this next step was probably the most physically demanding part of the entire project, and that was my choice to flatten the top using hand planes. If you've never experienced flattening a large tabletop by hand, I'd invite you to try it at least one time so you can appreciate the effort and advil it takes to do so. So the first step here is to hit the entire top using a number 7 joiner plane. Then from there, I'll move down to a number 4 smoother and remove any more remaining high spots. From there, I'll quickly hit the entire top with some 180 grit on the random orbit sander. This just helps smooth out any nicks that might be left from the plane irons. The most challenging part about doing this is that when you're done with the top, you have to now flip it over and do it again with the bottom, but I'll save you from having to endure that. So let's fast track the super sweaty Shane and trim off the ends of the panel using a track saw. Whenever I'm cutting my edges square on pieces like this, I like to reference off the same edge for each of my cuts. This way, if the panel isn't perfectly square, I only have one edge out of square instead of 2 corners. With my first cut complete, I can mark out the final length for the panel and trim it down. Now since this tabletop panel is about 1 5/16 of an inch or 33.3 millimeters thick, it's pushing my old track saw to its limit. So if you're ever unsure that your tools can make a cut this deep, it's probably better to take it in 2 passes. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do scenarios my son calls me out on all the time. Yeah, let's just ignore that kind of whining, grinding sound that you're hearing. Well done. With the final length trimmed out, I took the panel over to the table saw to center up the center strip and trim my top to its rough final width. To do that, I'm just going to take 2 light passes to even up my boards. Here I'm just careful to make sure that my initial cut is referenced off that same edge I used to trim the ends. This way, I'm ensured that my board will have 4 square edges when I'm done and I don't have to worry about it. Which is a lot better than my favorite pastime of waking up in the middle of the night and proceeding to think about things that are outside my control for 3 hours. And sticking with things I can control, next it's time to lay out the angles for the gem-shaped top. Once I had all 4 marked out, I again could use my track saw to make the cuts. Track saws are perfect for this type of procedure, but I'm all about giving you guys alternatives, and if you don't own a track saw, a circular saw with a metal stud could get you by. And if you love these types of tips as much as I do, give this video a like and make sure you subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. So with the top shape all trimmed out, next it's time to go ahead and clean up the edges, and to do that, I'm going to use an edge sanding jig. I picked this one up a few months ago, and if you make a lot of tables, I can't recommend it enough. It can be really tricky trying to hand plane edges on bulky panels like this one, and this attachment has saved me a ton of time and effort. I'll leave a link to it in the description for anyone who's interested. So with all the saw marks and burr marks removed, it's time to go ahead and chamfer the bottom of the tabletop. And to do that, I'm using a beefy 45° 2 5/8 inch bit. Now, when working with this large of a bit, it's crucial to take your time and make multiple passes to get to your final depth. And that's especially true when using a bit this large in a handheld router. If you're not comfortable doing so, you can use a smaller bit and then hand plane back to your final depth. Just do what you feel comfortable with. And I'll step down from my soapbox now. With a bit this large, dust collection's only going to go but so far, so be prepared to make quite a mess. And don't worry too much if you get a little wavy in the cut, because you can always clean that up with a hand plane or sanding later on. In my case, I didn't want to risk overcutting the corner and getting tear out, so I just kept the block plane close by and cleaned up the corners by hand. I'd much rather spend 2 minutes doing that than the next 5 hours cussing at my mistake. We've all been there. Again here, I'm going to turn to my sanding guide to clean up the router marks on the chamfer. This underside chamfer really lightens the look of the tabletop while not sacrificing actual weight and thickness, so it's kind of a win-win. With the tabletop pretty much wrapped up, I could turn my focus over to the legs. And the next step in the process is to bring my laminated boards over to the joiner and joint the glue seam. Since I've already flattened both faces, I'm not super worried about them being off, instead I just focus on the edge. Once I have a clean square edge, I can take my workpiece over to the table saw and rip the legs down to rough width. Here I'm keeping my pieces oversized because I'm going to dimension them down to their final thickness using my planer. Now, I will say that with boards this thick, you need a saw with some horsepower. If you lack that power from your table saw, you can always rip the stock down using a bandsaw as an alternative since we're just going for oversized pieces. This is a process I don't see a ton of other people taking advantage of, but it's worth exploring. You can nail your thickness pretty much dead on using a planer versus a table saw or bandsaw with a lot less errors being introduced. So next time you're working with substantial boards, definitely give it a try. Next, I needed to remove any bark that was remaining on my tabletop boards, so I just cleaned all that up using a chisel. But now with those voids exposed, I had to fill them in, and for that, I'm going to be using epoxy. I like using a little brown dye inside the epoxy to help make those voids and knots feel a little bit more natural, but I suppose if you really wanted to make them pop, you could color them blue or something. I don't know, maybe I'm getting old. Whenever I fill out those forums online where it asks for my birth year, I have to spin that thing like the Wheel of Fortune. The next day I could head back into the shop and sand back the cured epoxy with some 180 grit on the random orbit sander. With that detour complete, I could turn my attention back over to the legs. My leg stock is super thick, so I have to have a ton of blade exposed to cut it. That also means I can't use my regular miter sled to trim them down. So instead I'll just use my miter gauge, which will give me a little bit more headroom. When working with really thick workpieces like this, I like to use a clamp to help hold my workpiece against the fence. This ensures that the workpiece doesn't wobble off track during the cut, and it also makes me feel a little bit more comfortable when working with a really exposed blade because it's one less thing to worry about. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important that you use both common sense and your own level of comfort in the shop. If there's one thing you can do to make a cut a bit less dangerous or a bit less intimidating, you should do that. So with the legs dimensioned down to their final form, I could now focus on the rails and stretchers. Now, as I mentioned at the start, these are going to use mortise and tenon joinery. So all I have to do here is add 1 inch to my final board length. This additional inch will be used to create 1/2 inch tenons on each side. My plan for the drawer side rail is to construct my rail and drawer with a continuous grain pattern, which means I'm going to have to remove a minimal amount of material inside those cuts. But at this point, I want my 3 pieces to be exactly the length of my intact rear rail. This way I have plenty of room to finesse the fit on the drawer front later on. And don't worry if that doesn't quite make sense right now, it will shortly. With both my mortise and tenon parts all cut to their final dimension, I could go ahead and get to work on the actual joinery. But first, whenever I'm working with legs, I like to mark out their orientation on the top, this way I don't get confused about where each leg goes. From there, keeping the legs upright, I can mark out the rough location for each mortise. And when it comes to mortise and tenon joinery, the first thing I like to do is focus on the mortises. So for the joinery on this piece, I'll use the panther router. And once I have all my settings dialed in, I can go ahead and start cutting the mortises. Now, the reason I like to start with the mortises is because I find it's a lot easier to cut the tenons for a tight fit rather than the mortises. So by starting with my mortises first, I ensure that all my tenons will have a nice snug fit later on. The mortises I'm cutting here are for the upper apron, and I'll batch out my mortises and tenons by parts. So here I'll start with my apron joinery before moving on to the lower stretchers. Now, you'll probably notice that I had a little bit of overlap in my mortise location, so that's something I'm going to have to address with the tenons, and I'll show you how I do that later on. But for now, I just have to make a quick change to my panther router settings, and then I can go ahead and cut my apron tenons. So now that the settings are all locked in place, I can go ahead and cut the tenons. And I should have said so before now, but if you guys want plans for this project, just let me know down in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. With my first batch of tenons all cut out, I could go ahead and mark the location for the lower stretchers and reset the panther router for the smaller mortises. It goes without saying that you don't need a panther router to cut solid mortise and tenon joinery. I've done so plenty of times just using a router with an edge guide and my table saw. But if you are interested in getting a panther router and streamlining that process, I do have a discount code in the description that will save you a few $100. The mortise and tenon process here is exactly like it is for the upper apron. I think the trickiest part of this setup is just making sure the mortise location is aligned on both sides. That's only because in order to cut the joinery at the correct height, the workpiece has to be rotated, which in turn means the stop has to be flipped depending on which face I'm working on. And that's because the legs from left to right are just mirror versions of themselves. The last step here is to go ahead and cut the tenons on the end of my stretchers. And at this point, that's all pretty straightforward. It's kind of like when I asked my 7-year-old son what he learned in school today. He told me apparently not enough because he has to go back tomorrow. So with all the mortise and tenon joinery complete, now came the real test, which was seeing if everything actually fit together. Thankfully everything was pretty snug, but not so snug I couldn't fit any glue in the mortises. The next step was to go ahead and notch out the ends of some of my tenons on my side pieces. And again, I have to do this because my mortises overlap slightly. The good thing is this allows me to finesse my fits, creating a really snug and tight joint. Once I've cut my initial rabbets over at the table saw, I can just use a shoulder plane to clean up the tenon and fine tune the fit. Yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. Earlier I cut my front apron into 3 parts to create my continuous grain for my drawer front. Now I'll use those same parts to mark out the location for a pair of dados on my rear rail. Since these dados are going to be concealed, I'm going to cut them as exact width dados, meaning they're going to be the exact width of my stock, which in this case is 3/4 of an inch. Since I have my actual workpieces here, I'm going to reference each one individually to ensure that they are a perfect fit. Then I'll just lay my dado stack on a flat surface and use the tip of my finger to ensure that it's set to the correct width. For me, this trick works a bit better than trusting your gauges because your fingertips are incredibly sensitive. So with the dado stack installed at the table saw, I can go ahead and slide on my sled, then set the blade height and stop and cut the rabbets and dados. The rabbets will be going on the drawer side of the table, while the dados will go on the rear. With the joinery cut, I could assemble my parts and take the measurements for my internal supports. From there, I could head back over to the table saw and trim them down to their final length. I gotta tell you, I'm a sucker for well-fitting joinery. And when I saw these pieces slide into place so perfectly, it gave me chills. Which of course got me thinking, are you more of a fan of watching a joint come together or the process of seeing how it's crafted? Both can be equally satisfying, but let me know what your favorite is down in the comments. If you like watching the final joint come together, start your comment with perfect fit. If you prefer watching the process, start your comment with process. And as always, if you start your comment with perfect fit or process, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. So the next step in the process was to cut those leg profiles. And the first thing I need to do here is set up a sled. And once I've attached my sled to my leg profile template, I can attach some alignment blocks and hold down clamps using some CA glue and screws. Then I can bring the whole setup over to my table saw to cut in the angles. Now this leg profile was a little bit tricky in that I had to track my offcuts pretty closely. That's because I need them for each subsequent cut. So once the first cut is made, I'll reattach my offcuts using some blue tape to hold things square for the next round of cuts and so on. Now for the upper portion of the leg, I can use the same sled setup for both my cuts, but I do have to change the angle for the lower portion, and for that I'm going to have to knock off all my alignment blocks and set up a new sled. I always get nervous at procedures like this because if I make a mistake at this point, I'm going to have to go back and remake the leg stock, then recut all the mortise and tenon joinery just to get back to this exact point. So I often find myself triple and quadruple checking my alignment and positioning, and even questioning whether those were correct even while I'm making the cuts. But sometimes you just have to trust yourself and live on the edge. It's kind of like answering the phone when you don't recognize the number calling. Yeah, I'd say this time it was worth the risk. So with the leg profiles all cut out, it was on to cleaning up my parts. To do that, I headed over to the bench to sand all my workpieces up to 180 grit and plane down any saw marks along the edges. At this point, I'll also start confirming my parts' location and orientation and mark those out using some blue tape and a felt tip. This just helps me to organize my parts as well as gives me a good reference for what my grain patterns are going to look like. When cleaning up the edges, I'm careful not to get too heavy-handed with the hand plane. Otherwise, it could affect the fit of my upper rail. So here I'm just taking light passes. Once I was satisfied with the fit and finish of my rails and stretchers, I could move on to cleaning up the legs themselves. Again here, I'm not focusing on any one area for too long so that I don't introduce a dip in the joinery. Instead, I'm just removing any surface burning as well as saw marks. And after a few minutes, I have a couple of legs that even Ralphie's father would be proud to display. The lower shelf of the table is going to be held in place using a ledger strip. So what I need to do now is cut the groove into my stretchers. And here, I'm going to use a dado stack. For any of my European viewers who aren't allowed to own a dado stack, you could just cut this using a 3/8 inch or, more appropriately, 9.5mm router bit at the router table. Yep, still decilingual. Now, this next step's probably not completely necessary, but I'm going to do it anyway. The groove in my stretchers also cuts into my tenon, and I'm not a fan of removing that material, so I'm going to go ahead and replace it with an offcut. So I'll just CA glue it in place, then use a flush trim saw to even it up and clean up the tenon with a chisel. Then for my side stretchers where the tenon was rabbeted, I'll recut that rabbet just using my shoulder plane. From there, I was on to the more stressful part of any large build, which is the glue up. Luckily, this one came together without much trouble, but I think it's also important to point out here that I saved my offcuts specifically for this glue up. And that's a really important thing to remember when you're working with angles. Save your offcuts until the project is complete. This way you can use them to hold things at 90 when you need to. For you guys who save everything anyways, that shouldn't be a problem. You know who you are. Next, it was time to get those drawer slides installed so I could take the measurements from my drawer box. Thankfully, I could just clamp a scrap piece of ply to the underside of my rails to hold the drawer slides in place while I fasten them in. For this one, it's probably no surprise that I'm going to be using Bloom's soft close drawer slides. Once I find something I like, I stick with it. With the drawer slides in place, I could go ahead and take the measurements from my drawer box. Now, I had a rough idea what the drawer box dimensions were going to be, but it's best not to assume this type of thing. Interior dimensions always turn out better when you take them off your actual workpiece. With the dims in hand, I could get to work milling down my material. So the sides of my drawer box will be crafted in cherry, while the fronts and backs will be walnut. This will add a ton of contrast to the dovetails and emphasize that design decision a bit more. When I was considering what style of drawer box to make for this piece, I felt like dovetails were the only option given that they're angular and fit the theme of the design pretty well. So with my material trimmed out to about a 32nd of an inch oversized, I can take my workpieces over to the workbench and again plane down the edges to remove any saw marks. Now at this point it's super important that all my boards be the exact same width, because if they're not, it's going to affect the fit of my dovetails. So with that in mind, I always like to stack my boards together and then just use my phalanges to check that they're all even. And when they are, it feels almost as good as getting into bed with freshly cleaned sheets. Almost. Back over at the table saw, I could trim down my drawer box pieces to their final length. If you can, it's also a really good idea at this point to trim off a piece you can use for testing. I know in the past I've asked you guys if you use test pieces or if you just go all in, and the results were kind of mixed. But when it comes to dovetails or joinery in general, it's always a good idea to have one or two pieces you can test with. If anything, it's just good to use to set your fence if you need to make more of that particular part. From there I could use a marking gauge to lay out my dovetails. Since I'll be using the pantser router, it's not completely necessary to do this, but I do find that when I use a marking gauge, the dovetails have less tear out. Now, I know a few of you guys are not a huge fan of cutting dovetails with the pantser router, but unfortunately I don't have time to hand cut dovetails these days, and the pantser router makes quick work of it. But just like hand cutting dovetails, I'm going to start with my tails. I like starting with the tails first because it helps me accurately lay out the pens. Again, this is exactly how I like to do it when hand cutting dovetails, so the order of operations is exactly like hand cutting without the actual hand cutting. Once I have my tails cut on both the ends of my side pieces, I can do a quick bit swap and reset the pantser router to cut the pens. This is where I really like to use the test piece that I cut earlier, because dialing in the pen fit can be a little tricky. Luckily I've cut enough 5/8 inch thick dovetails at this point that I can get pretty darn close on my first try. But anytime you're using a jig, it's always a good idea to test with an actual offcut from your current project, because as we all know, 5/8 of an inch can vary from project to project. With my pins and tails cut, I can bring the drawer box pieces over to the workbench and test the fit. When it comes to dovetails, I don't aim to make them so tight I have to muscle the joint closed. Instead, I want a reasonably snug fit that will accept a minimal amount of glue. Joints tend to swell once PVA glue is applied since it's water-based, so leaving a smidgen of wiggle room in there is always a good idea. Once the joints are fully seated, I can lay the piece on the bench and check to make sure there's no wobbles. Yep, that's good to go. The final step before assembly is to cut the groove for the drawer bottom, and I like to do that just using a flat grind blade at the table saw. Since I'll be using a 1/4 inch thick piece of walnut plywood for the drawer bottom, a 1/4 inch dado stack would just be too wide, so 2 passes with an 1/8 inch blade ensures a snug fit. Once all the grooves are cut, all I need to do is cut down my box bottom, and then we're on to the glue up. When gluing up dovetails, I prefer to use the least amount of glue I can. Again, we don't want to swell that joint. So I tend to lean towards using an acid brush as long as they're quality enough that they don't lose their bristles in the first 2 seconds. For these joints, I'm going to be using Titebond 2 Dark. But I feel like it's worth mentioning that whenever you're gluing up a cherry on cherry joint, it's a good idea to use Titebond 3. That's because the polymers in TB1 and TB2 can turn your glue seams red after a few years, so it's something to be mindful of. That probably would have been important to note at the tabletop section, but better late than never. So with glue applied to each of my joints, I could go ahead and drop them in a couple clamps. I like to use 2 clamps on either side of my drawer boxes just to ensure the joints are fully seated while the glue dries. Next, we're on to the ledger strips. And again here, I'm going to take my measurements directly off my workpiece and then head over to the table saw to trim them down. Now in the past, I've usually rabbeted thicker pieces to create my ledger strips, but that was mainly on heavier duty items, like the grill station and my workbench. For this piece, there's not going to be a ton of weight on this lower shelf, so I'm not super worried about it, and instead I'm just going to cut out a couple strips that I can glue into the groove. And I think that's kind of important when it comes to building furniture. It's always good to think about the use case for a particular piece when you're thinking about how to construct it. I mean, we all want to construct these things to survive natural disasters, but at the end of the day, they don't actually have to. And once I had all 4 ledger strips trimmed out, I could use an abundance of clamps to hold them in place while the glue dried. Next, we're on to the shiplap. And the first thing I'm going to do here is just rip all my pieces down to their final width. Here I am aiming for the final width because laying out shiplap can be a little bit tricky. That's because we want the shiplap to obviously cover the width of the area, but we also want to leave room for wood movement. So here I'm aiming for my gaps to be a 1/16 of an inch with an overlap of 5/16 of an inch. Now, finding how wide you need your shiplap to be can be a bit of trial and error your first go around. So if you're new to the process, I would recommend cutting a few scrap pieces before going all in. Making the shiplap is not overly complicated, but the spacing can get complex, so just take your time. Once you've mathed your pieces, you can go ahead and cut the lap joints or rabbets. And the idea here is to cut your rabbets half the depth of the board's thickness or just a hair over. For this process, again, I'll just use a dado stack. Now, luckily my depth and width are exactly the same here at 5/16 of an inch, so the setup is pretty straightforward. Once I have my fence and blade height configured, I'll toss on a couple featherboards and cut my rabbets alternating for each side. Now given that my legs are slightly inset at the 2 corners, I have to notch out my 2 end boards. So I'll just quickly take that measurement from the leg, then head over to the bandsaw to cut out my notches. And while we're here, here's another bandsaw thought. One minute you're young, then the next you're turning down the radio in the car so you can see better. True story. And with the notches notched, I could drop the shiplap in place and check the fit. It's always so nice when it works first try. Unfortunately, when it comes to the drawer boxes, I got a little overzealous with the glue up and forgot to notch my rear panel for the drawer slides. It's not the end of the world, but it could have been avoided. Anyway, to resolve that issue, I'm just going to use a pole saw to make a couple relief cuts, then use a chisel to knock out the material. I'll be the first to admit that this isn't the sexiest solution, but let's be honest, no one's ever going to see these unless I put it on YouTube and show the world. You didn't see anything, right? Next up, I could go ahead and clean up those dovetails just using a hand plane. If there's any hairline voids or gaps in the dovetail, a wee bit of wood glue and some sandpaper will help fill those in, and no one will be the wiser. With the tails and pins all cleaned up, I could go ahead and focus on the top and bottom edges. Now, because I already cleaned these edges up earlier, there's not a whole lot that needs to be done, but I do like to take one more pass with a hand plane just to make sure all my edges are nice and even. Once those edges are oh so satisfyingly smooth, I could move on to plunging in the rear pin mortise for the drawer slides. With the rear pin mortises in place, I could next attach the drawer slide clips, and for that I'll just use the same jig. This is another one of those jigs that I get a lot of questions on, so if you guys are interested in picking one up, I'll leave a link in the description. From there, I could slide the drawer box in place and confirm that everything was working correctly. As many times as I've used these slides, I still get great satisfaction out of that soft close functionality. Next, it was time to get to work on the drawer front, and the first thing I'm going to do is take my dimensions directly off my workpiece again and trim that drawer front down by a hair so that it has a 32nd of an inch gap on either side. Here I'm just careful to take that 32nd of an inch off either side of my drawer face so that there's minimal disruption to my grain pattern. With my drawer face sitting all smiles, I could move on to creating the pole. About 6 months ago, I purchased this bar of brass to create some poles for my triangular-inspired console table. And I wanted to give this coffee table a similar treatment to help kind of pull those pieces together. No pun intended. So my idea here was to mimic that top angle of the tabletop. So I went ahead and marked that out on a scrap piece and then transferred those markings onto the top of my brass pole. From there, I'll head over to the bandsaw and trim out the shape. Now, as long as you're using a 4 to 6 TPI blade, cutting brass at the bandsaw isn't going to be a big deal. I'm not by any means recommending that you use this on a new blade, or cut pieces that are an inch thick or anything. But for 1/4 inch thick pieces like this one, it's no biggie. To remove the blade marks, I'll just use a couple diamond stones and work through the grits. I really enjoy making one-off parts like this for pieces because it adds a more unique quality to the overall design. Plus, anytime that I can stack design elements into other parts of the project, I think it's a win-win. Kind of like how I now clean my house to the music I used to party to. Next, I can route the mortise for the pull into the drawer front. I like to cut my mortises by plunging a hole at the start and stop points, and then go back and remove the material between those points, working from left to right. This just ensures that I don't overcut my mortise. For this cut, I'm going to stop a little short anyway, so that I can use some chisels to clean up the ends. When cleaning out the mortise, I'm just careful to follow those lines that are already established by the cut. So here I've just marked out the ends of where the pole is going to live and take small nibbles until I reach my final width, which is going to be right there. To attach the pole to my drawer front, I'm just going to use some 5-minute epoxy. Now honestly, the odors off this stuff's pretty gnarly, so I don't use it very often in the shop, but when I need a tight bond in order to keep working, 5-minute epoxy is my go-to. My only other concern was just making sure I didn't get any epoxy on the brass, because removing it at this point would be pretty difficult. After about 10 minutes, kind of playing it safe, I could attach the drawer front to the drawer box. Again here, I'll just clamp a scrap piece to my apron so the drawer bottom aligns with the bottom of the apron, which makes for easy installation. Once I was happy with the alignment, I just attached a couple of F-style clamps, popped in a few pilot holes, and drove in a pair of screws. Honestly, this is one of the easier drawer front installations I've had in a while. Then I could finally fully appreciate that soft close action. Yeah, that's money. To attach the tabletop to my base, I'm going to be using figure 8 fasteners. I've tried a lot of different fasteners over the years, but these are the easiest and most consistent in my experience. The key is to find a brand that makes high quality figure 8 fasteners and not the cheap knockoffs. I especially like them for large tabletops like this one because they allow for wood movement and concealability. Double whammy. The final step before finishing was to install my brand. And I'll just do that with a router template, CA glue, and a mallet. And with the brand in place, it was time for the finish. And the finish on this one is probably no surprise, but I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat Pure. It's honestly the best finish I've used for tabletops because it's incredibly durable, easy to repair, and has a natural sheen. So while I wrap up the finish, allow me to thank you for watching the show and supporting the channel. As many of you know, I create these pieces and film these videos on nights and weekends, so having the support from you guys means the world. That said, if you'd like to support the show further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merchandise, an invite to the Discord server where we can chat about woodworking techniques and projects, plus some other perks that you just can't get through YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link in the description. And if you can't join today, no sweat. Thank you for liking, commenting, and sharing the videos. And as always, to you guys who've already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. With the finish wrapped up, I could use my 16th inch shims to align my shiplap, then tack it in place with a pen nailer. From there, I could use a little glue and light sanding to conceal the pens and then finish the top of the shiplap. And the final step was to align the tabletop to the base, pre-drill, then pop in a few screws. Last, but certainly not least, I could reinstall the drawer, and then we're on to those glamour shots. This project wasn't just about creating a functional piece of furniture, but also about embracing the natural beauty of materials while adding a modern and geometric twist. From hand planing that massive tabletop to cutting precise mortise and tenon joinery, this build had it all, plus a few lessons in patience along the way. I'm absolutely thrilled about how this gem shined up. The form of the legs and angled tabletop really embraced the design goals, and the simple yet elegant treatment of the drawer speaks volumes without raising its voice. This is absolutely one of those projects that will sit near and dear to my heart for years to come. So if you enjoyed this journey and you'd like to go on another, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.